Hello, my name's Andrew Pollard, and I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to speak with you today about the development of the Oxford COVID-19 vaccine, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which began, in fact, 18 months ago. And of course, it's good to reflect just before starting on the huge impact of the pandemic here in the UK, with over 125,000 deaths caused by the pandemic coronavirus. But some hope in a huge rollout of the vaccine program already during the first 6 months of 2021, and evidence from the UK that the vaccine program here has prevented 14,000 deaths and tens of thousands of hospital admissions already. Of course, we do have to remember with the positive news currently in the UK that many parts of the world are still suffering from further waves of disease and don't have the same access to vaccines. And you can see here the global picture where the pandemic is still very much burning through in many countries with new waves of disease emerging. And although it looks as if there are big differences between regions of the world in the amount of spread of the virus, of course, this is a figure showing confirmed cases, and access to testing is very different in different parts of the world, and the true burden is quite difficult to estimate. Now, we are fortunate in having a number of different technologies available that can be used in order to provide protection against coronavirus. And on this cartoon, you can see that there are a number of different types of vaccine that are mentioned. What they all have in common is that they use the spike protein of coronavirus to induce immune responses. And so the protein vaccines that are in development, such as the vaccine by Novavax, is the spike protein with an adjuvant that's injected to provide protection. The other direct injection of protein is with the inactivated viral vaccines. There are two that are being very widely used around the world at the moment from Sinopharm and Sinovac in China. So each of these involves the direct injection of protein, but other technologies have used the cellular machinery in our bodies to produce protein from genetic material. And so, for example, here the RNA vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna, after immunization, the RNA is taken up by our cells, harnesses the cellular machinery, and then turns that into spike protein to be recognized by our immune system. And finally, a number of viral vector vaccines, including the Oxford vaccine, the Russian vaccine from the Gamaleya Institute, CanSino from China, and also the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, all use viral vectors to transport a copy of the spike protein DNA into our cells, which then gets converted into spike protein to generate an immune response. So all of the vaccines use essentially the same immunological process to drive immune responses. As we look at where things have got to today with these different technologies, we are now, as of a few days ago, at 2.6 billion doses of vaccines that are now available around the world. And you can see from this slide that the most widely available vaccine is currently the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine in 178 countries. And that has been a major part of our plan in the development of the vaccine, was to have it available as widely as possible, so that there was better equity in the distribution of vaccines. And although there continue to be supply problems across all of the developers, things are slowly improving, and certainly the second half of this year, there should be many more doses available for global distribution. So this is the first 9 vaccines which are licensed for use in various different countries. And then there are a number of others which so far have a more limited distribution, but are all important in contributing to the huge global effort that there is to control the pandemic virus. And having a number of different technologies and different developers has been very important in getting us where we are today at this point in 2021, with many people last year predicting we wouldn't have any vaccines available by this stage, and yet 2.6 billion doses have already been deployed. And one of the reasons for the huge success of being able to get from a standing start 18 months ago to having so many doses deployed is that we already knew a lot about coronaviruses. There had been 2 major coronavirus outbreaks which were a cause of enormous concern over the last 20 years. The first being the SARS coronavirus back in 2002, which had about an 11% mortality. And the second was the MERS coronavirus, which emerged from camels in about 2012 and had a frightening 35% mortality associated with infection. Fortunately for both of these viruses, the cases were very severe, didn't have much shedding during the pre-symptomatic stage, and by isolating the cases, it's been possible to halt the outbreaks. But nevertheless, because of the threat that these 2 outbreaks caused, there was a lot of work on the development of vaccines for coronaviruses, and the research involving many animal studies demonstrated the key role of spike protein in protection against coronavirus infection, and gave a huge head start in understanding the biology and the vaccinology for COVID when it emerged just over 18 months ago. So we knew how to make a vaccine because of those experiences, and it was therefore possible, as soon as the genetic sequence of the coronavirus was known, for developers all around the world to start work on a coronavirus vaccine. And here in Oxford, my colleagues Sarah Gilbert and Tess Lamb received the genetic sequence of the coronavirus by email and started work on developing a vaccine on the 11th of January 2020, before we even knew that this virus was a pandemic threat. And that work involved putting the gene sequence into an adenovirus vector so that that could be used as a vaccine to transport the spike protein gene in a vaccine into our bodies to then induce immunity to spike protein. And this was based on a very similar vaccine which had been developed by Sarah Gilbert for MERS over the last few years and tested in early phase trials in humans. So we already knew that this approach would generate immune responses in humans, and that the approach plan was likely to be successful. So during February, as it became very rapidly apparent that there was global spread of the virus threatening both our lives and our livelihoods around the world, we set to work in developing the vaccine manufacturing for the early phase trials, and working through the approval process for the first phase 1 clinical trial. And that was where there was an enormous challenge that we faced, because the normal development process takes somewhere between 5 and 10 years, and may even take longer than that, because normally We do each step in development in series. We do the development cautiously so that we can make sure that we don't invest in a vaccine which may not work by making sure that we've reviewed all of the immune response data before moving to the next phase and starting manufacturing for that phase and applying for funding. Clearly, in this situation in the pandemic, that would have taken far too long to have an impact. And so we had to develop a program where manufacturing happened at risk before we knew if the vaccines would work, and the phases were overlapped with each other, so that as soon as data emerged to inform the next step in development, we were all ready to start with the volunteers enrolled and ready to go. And this approach, which has been used by the developers around the world, has allowed us to get to this point with billions of doses already into arms by June 2021. Now, our phase 3 trials were initiated here in the UK at the end of May, beginning of June 2021. And we also worked with clinical trial sites in Brazil and in South Africa to enroll over 24,000 trial participants who have taken part in the trials, which led to the first authorization of the Oxford vaccine. Importantly, in the development phase last year, we also made a partnership with AstraZeneca, who shared the same vision as we did, that the vaccine should be developed and made available not for profit to get the widest possible access around the world as soon as possible. And that partnership has worked extremely well. And they also made a further partnership with the world's largest vaccine producer, the Serum Institute of India, who with AstraZeneca have also been running clinical trials to show that the vaccine is immunogenic, makes good immune responses in South Asia, with AstraZeneca in Japan and Russia, and also efficacy trials in the United States. Importantly, with that partnership with AstraZeneca, we needed to make sure that the vaccine could be produced for the different regions of the world. And so the concept was to set up more than 20 manufacturing sites around the globe to both protect the supply chain into each country and also to avoid vaccine nationalism as much as possible, to ensure that doses could be made available to the different regions of the world. And currently there are more than 500 million doses that have been produced at these manufacturing sites and deployed to the many countries around the world. By the end of November, we had the first data from the clinical trials, and the data showed that the vaccine was incredibly effective. There were no hospitalizations, severe disease or deaths in anyone in the trial who'd received a vaccine, and the overall efficacy, including against mild disease, was around 70%. And this trial data from our trials in the UK, South Africa and Brazil was used to present to the MHRA here in the UK and now more than 100 different regulators to achieve approval of the vaccine for emergency use to help control the pandemic. And the regulatory approval here in the UK came on the 30th of December, rapidly followed by approvals in a number of other countries. And bringing the timeline here to be 11 months from receiving the sequence with spike protein to approval, or from the first dose given in clinical trials on the 23rd of April, just 8 months to emergency use authorization, so that the vaccine could then be used here in the UK and rapidly in many other countries as well. And this development process was as efficient as is possible. in the circumstances of a pandemic and facing many headwinds through lockdowns and supply shortages for everything from PPE to thermometers. But the clinical trials teams overcame that, and I'm enormously grateful to all of them for their efforts. And of course, this also represents the contributions of 24,000 trial participants. And interestingly, there were tens of thousands of people more who were prepared to come forward and take part in the clinical trials. Since the vaccine has been deployed, we now have very good data showing high levels of effectiveness of the vaccine against hospitalization from the first dose in all age groups. These data on this slide represent the oldest adults and effectiveness against the Alpha variant, and you can see that the levels of effectiveness of the vaccine are very similar to those of the Pfizer vaccine. This is after just the first dose, so the most early reported data. So this evidence of effectiveness against hospitalization is key because it's hospitalization that makes the pandemic a pandemic. If there was no hospitalization, we would be living with this virus already. But of course, variants continue to emerge, and we have more good news over the last few weeks about vaccine effectiveness against the Delta variant. And you can see here two reports of data, first of all about the Alpha variant on the left, and then the most recent report showing that the vaccine was 92% effective against hospitalization with the Delta variant. And these studies that have been conducted in both clinical trials and now in the real world with the Delta variant show that vaccination of populations can provide huge levels of protection against the severe disease, and gives us hope that if this is sustained as further variants emerge in the months and years ahead, that we can be optimistic. A really important part of the timeline in 2021 was that after the MHRA approval, a month later was the approval by the European Medicines Agency, which was critical because that activated the World Health Organization processes that led to the authorization of manufacturing sites in India and in South Korea that would allow doses of the vaccine to be shipped through Covax. And this, for me, is one of the highlights of the last 6 months. I was seeing the first doses arriving in the low and middle income countries through that Covax process. And you can see here, as of the 19th of June, 88 million doses of vaccines have been shipped through Covax, and around 90% of those are the vaccine developed here in Oxford with our colleagues around the UK and in Brazil and South Africa. Now, although we're in a very good place now in many countries, as I mentioned, in some countries there are very few doses of vaccine available, and we continue to face huge global shortages of vaccine. And particularly, as you can see here on this figure, that in Africa there have been some doses distributed, but we're currently very much behind with availability of doses, and the supply shortages continue to challenge the rollout in many countries. I am optimistic that this will improve over the course of the next year, the focus being on making sure that older adults, healthcare workers, and people with other health conditions are vaccinated first, because that will have the biggest impact on mortality globally. I'll end there, and I just want to thank again the fantastic team here in Oxford, The trial site investigators and teams across the 19 sites in the UK and the sites in Brazil and South Africa. And of course, our funders and the trial volunteers who so willingly took part in the clinical trials that have led to this vaccine with global distribution and a huge public health impact. Thank you very much.